Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Digital Leaders Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing skills-based hiring and harnessing the power of age diversity, plus other headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. The audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. And don't forget to check us out at DEInetwork.com for coaching, assistance, industry briefings, and peer-to-peer user groups. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up Digital Enterprise Institute, as well as our sister organization, the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members all around automation, enterprise, AI, and digital transformation. My co-host, as always, is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, an author, an educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, and former advisor from EY and Accenture. Carlos, hello, buddy.
Yeah, good afternoon. Great to be back.
Good to see you again. I see you got the goatee going. I like it. Looking good.
Experiment at my wife's suggestion, so I'm gonna give it a couple of weeks. We'll see where it goes from there.
All right, we'll take a poll afterwards for anybody who's been watching for a while. Hey, listen, your two favorite people were in the news again this week: Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Your favorites?
Well, I tell you, yesterday was a day. As someone who grew up in New York City, right? I've never known life without Trump. I always have was sort of grew up with him in the headlines. So it's just this remarkable saga of a human life, right? That, or going back to the Central Park Five when I was a little kid, and then seeing what I thought I would never see ever in my life, which is him walking into a courtroom, sitting in the dock, right, and having to plead, on a personal note, no matter where you stand, my sense was that they were pushing a little bit, right, with this case. I happen to be an amateur scholar of white collar crime. I have been for years, and I think it's a pretty fair statement that anyone else, right, this wouldn't have happened. And I got a feeling that sooner or later this has to go to a tax issue, or they're not going to get very far. We don't know everything still, and I'm going to guess that when they unwrap all the envelopes, somewhere there we're going to read Internal Revenue Service, and that this goes back to somebody trying to obscure, right, something from the IRS, because I think otherwise it looks kind of shaky to me.
It's always how they get you, right? Again, like you say, regardless of how you feel on it, where you are in politics, we'll save politics for a different show. But it's definitely historic, and I think you're right. I think this particular thing's it reminds me a lot of the Al Capone thing, right, where he went down for tax evasion, not for all the other crimes that he was accused of, right? Because
I think they have to have something like that, or I don't think this thing makes the trial. I could see, right, a motion to dismiss in some particular way. I mean, I don't know Alvin Bragg, so I would imagine that the stories is a pretty cautious person. So you would imagine there's more in the suitcase that just hasn't been revealed so far. So we'll see where it goes. No matter, like you said, no matter who you are and which side you are, right? It was just a remarkable day to see a former U.S. president sort of making that trip down to the lower, side of Manhattan for his day in court. So
yeah, and for the rest of us, some of us were surprised that on April 1st we still had our blue check verification from Twitter.
Is it on? Is it not on? I think every article I read, I can't figure out exactly what's happening with that whole process.
Neither can I, but as I said when we had this first debate, Carlos, I mean, he's a master at staying in the news. I mean, it's either complete dysfunction or, like Trump, like him, I hate him, just a media mogul who knows how to get attention. And even though you told me during our prep last week that you didn't want to talk about Twitter, I'm still bringing it up because you can't avoid it.
Well, Twitter is Twitter, right? It's America's Times Square. So we'll see whether, again, I'm not sure whether it's gotten better since he took over. I don't know, because it's hard to read through the articles and get a sense of, is there a turnaround plan? Is there a plan? I haven't seen, okay, here is the strategy that justified basically paying a pretty nice premium, right? There was probably a 20% premium on the valuation, which makes you think, okay, you're a very smart person, way more money than anybody else ever has. So you don't something that doesn't turn over 50 billion without a plan, I would imagine. So what that plan is, I guess, is a well-guarded secret, but maybe
Yeah.
we'll learn of it soon enough, right?
So let's get to our main topic, and we wanted to kind of focus, away from the news and the AI stuff that's been going on that we've been talking about so much over the last several weeks, and really get to a leadership topic, right, Carlos? But
Yeah.
it's not just a general topic. It is in the news because you see all the things happening with layoffs and hiring and changes to the way this happens, right? And so I wanted to invite an expert to join us. I want to introduce the audience to Alix Grasso. She's a HR and recruiting expert, longtime friend and advisor to ERPA AI and Digital Enterprise Institute. And Alix, good to have you on the show.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you. I grew up in tech, and I recently stepped out of tech and joined American Steel and Aluminum as their HR generalist. They support the building of submarines for Electric Boat. So, an interesting, timely, industry with global events. But I think, in what has been going on with the world, there's so much to talk about in terms of hiring, recruiting, retention, talent. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in tech right now is a market right sizing.
So I wanted to ask you about that before I let Carlos ask you the more intelligent, deep questions that I know he's got for you. What's your sense of what's happening? Because even on this show, right, we started talking about recession and the Great Resignation, and then it was hiring, and then it was layoffs. And where do you see it? You're probably a little bit more ahead of the headlines, right, in the day-to-day work that you do. Where do you see us going in the next couple months here?
Yeah, I want to back up and look back before we look forward, right? So I think the pandemic happened, right? We were all at home, life changed. I think people's careers were a place where they had a lot of control, right? At the end of the day, if you're happy in your relationship and you like your children and you'd like to keep all of your family, and you live somewhere and maybe you changed that, or maybe you decided you couldn't, and your career is a place where people had a little bit of objectivity, right? Is their career fulfilling them? Is it making them happy? Is their company culture a fit to them? How did their company respond to the pandemic? How does that sit with them, right? And I think you saw a lot of people move for a lot of reasons, right? At the same time, we saw some industries change. All different types of tech that supported people being at home boomed, and some of it waned shortly thereafter. And so we've seen some companies grow and some companies grow in a sustaining way. And, I think a lot of the big tech layoffs that you've seen are companies sort of said, okay, we're growing. Okay, we're not growing as fast. We're not growing as fast as we had been in the last few quarters. And headcount is a funny thing because you want to predict headcount for growth, but you don't want to bring on so many people that you have to then have layoffs, right? And workforce management is a really sticky piece of this, right? So, what is the right number of workers? What are the right titles? What are the right jobs, in terms of our productivity? And it's hard to always be in front of that. So if you are over hiring, the answer when you have a downturn or, kind of the first steps into a recession, is typically a layoff. So that way you can make sure that you can, afford payroll going forward, most importantly. And then at the same time, we saw a lot of startups boom during COVID, right? So in terms of, software engineers, StreamYard, the platform that we're on now, as I was sitting in backstage, as you two started chatting, I looked at their career site. They're hiring software engineers in 5 different countries. And, that's their most predominant position open now. So you hear all these headlines that are, companies are having layoffs and they're hiring. they're probably not hiring for the same positions they're laying off. They probably still need strong technical talent because these are, tech companies with software platforms, and they probably don't need as many mid-level management, coordinators, support roles, things of that nature. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the workforce, and I consider it a right sizing of tech. I was at a conference at Harvard Business School in January 2019 on venture capital and private equity, and that's when they started talking about how tech is going to right size. And I think this has been a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and I think COVID, delayed it, right? So much changed so quickly that the market is sort of kind of catching up with itself now.
So, Alex, let me go ahead and jump into our conversation as a kind of historian of higher ed. I'm fascinated by this movement that I read about now to eliminate the degree requirement, especially in the tech space, which seems to be leading this charge, right? Higher ed started as way back in the day as religious training, and then it became a kind of social badge, right? If you had gone to this school or that school, the fact that you had gone there mattered more than what you'd actually studied there. These are Harvard man, quote unquote, right back in the 40s and 50s.
I have a Babson MBA. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so
yeah.
And now we're entering this new age where we're saying, look, we don't really care so much about the social badging, right? Because the technical world moves so quickly that we actually are looking for skills primarily, less so the badge. And my question for you is, do you see that as an outlier at this point, or is that a real thing? Are we really entering, call it a post-degree era? And if so, how is that happening? How is that actually being implemented?
Yeah, so I'm Boston based. HubSpot, which is a big Boston employer, was one of the first employers to totally take degrees off all of their job postings.
All of them.
Okay. Yeah. Really in a strong effort to diversity, equity, inclusion practices, and identifying that there wasn't necessarily that requirement that everybody's gone to a 4-year university. I think one of the things that you're starting to see in software, right, which is a skill. Coding is a skill, right? You're starting to see people who maybe don't take a traditional path, don't go to a 4-year university, but are coming out of boot camps, that are coming out of online programs, that are able to code just as well as their counterparts who are coming out of undergrad, right? And because there's such a labor shortage for people that can code with the growth of technology, I think it makes a lot of sense for organizations to adapt skills-based hiring programs for technical skills. I'd made a note that I'd moved over to, American Steel and Aluminum. So when we talk about skills-based hiring, that's welding, right? For example, right? That's a technical skill. And maybe you've gone to school to learn welding, or maybe it's something that you learned, through a technical program, right? Maybe it wasn't a formal training. Maybe you were just able to kind of pick up those skills and then take a certification program and, complete the certifications that you need to be certified in that area. And I think you're starting to see coding go in a lot of that same skill sets. I think mechanics kind of come to mind, right? Just, thinking about technical skills broadly. There used to be a point in time when we wanted mechanics to have formal education, or that didn't even exist for them, and then they needed formal education. It's a skill, right? And I think there's a lot of ways to obtain a skill these days, especially with the increase of technology and the ability to learn skills online.
Alex, do you see any kind of, I don't want to call it like a glass ceiling in this phenomenon, where you say, okay, great, sure, we'll hire you, we'll make you a program or whatever, but you're never going to be a senior vice president, you're never going to be CEO, right? You're not going to make the C-suite. Or do you see any of that? Or is it really, look, once you open this door, you have to say that, conceptually, right? We could be talking about the CEO of a tech company who never went to college and just through the ranks, which is something you don't really see today for the most part.
The article that Dan is sharing, I thought was really, really interesting, from HBS. And it does bring up a really good point that if your organization means it, means that they would like to do skill-based hiring, that it's best done in a cohort. It's best done so you're not doing it in a tentative way. You want people to feel really empowered and like you're committing to this, and that they're not here on a tentative basis to see if they can prove out a model, which I think is just really important to how you treat people. But also that you're watching that, that you're watching in your performance reviews if these people are being promoted. Yeah, I have an MBA, something like over 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs don't, right? So there's a really good argument that you don't need an MBA to be a CEO. What will that look like in 25 years? I don't know.
The other thing that I found interesting from this week's reading was this another article that talked about age diversity.
Yeah.
And you hinted at that as well, that they mentioned that at one company, they actually had 5 generations for the first time ever working in the same company at the same time, right? And so how do you see that issue? And again, right, this seems to be something that will be around for a while, because the article is saying that they can foresee the 3 or 4 generation company lasting for at least another 10 or 20 years. So
yeah, absolutely. Here in New England, and I don't know who their current head of diversity is, but I went to a great presentation once by, it was at the time the current head of diversity at Eversource, the utility company. And it was just about that they had 4 generations in the workforce, now 5, right? To your point, as we're starting to see, Gen Z more and more and more in the workforce, and, how do you have 5 different generations of people? There was an example in this article that is currently on the screen that I thought was really interesting, and it was talking about nurses, and it was talking about kind of nurse-patient interaction, but I think it could really go into every kind of walk of life. If we're in a business setting or any setting and I glance at my phone, will you think it's rude?
Yeah.
Right? Is that just kind of learned behavior? Is that something that, like, my phone vibrated and maybe you didn't hear it, so I've learned to just look at my phone? I think different generations have different interactions with their phone. One of the things that this article brought up that I also thought was really interesting was generational identity to text, right? If I text you, is it an emergency, or do you see it as, oh, it's just a text, I can reply tomorrow? And I think a lot of it comes down to communication, understanding what's important, understanding your own cultural norms, right? Are we a culture where we want you to respond? Are we a culture where you can wait till tomorrow, whether it be a text or a phone call or an email? And I think really identifying your company culture and identifying your communication norms goes a really long way to help people of different, all different types of backgrounds, right? Whether we're talking about those with degrees and those with non-degrees, different age generations, different socioeconomic classes, to be able to work in a professional way together that creates cohesion.
It's a really interesting, the age diversity thing is really, I think, apropos right now, Alex, because you're in this environment now where it seems like where the dust is going to settle is on some sort of hybrid work environment, not completely work from home, not completely in the office. And one of the selling points, for this is that there's actually Gen Zers now that have never worked in an office. Right. And so now having the ability to kind of, commingle, older generations who, by the way, did not do as well at the beginning of the pandemic because they were not used to remote working, and they're more used to the interaction that an office has. Now being able to work with people who've never been in an office to really create a more productive kind of environment. I think maybe the younger generations and the older generations kind of need each other if that's where we're going. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, since I've been in an HR role where I have been implementing technology within HR for a couple of years now, so continuously going in and implementing HR systems, applicant tracking systems, and you run into the do we have Spanish instructions for the time card? right? Do we have, instructions for how to download this on your mobile phone? Do we have instructions for, kind of every piece of technology for every learning style, for different, language barriers and types of communication? Is it better to send a training as a PowerPoint or a short video or both, right? I think some of it is kind of identifying your population and meeting them where they are. So there might need to be more training and documentation for your non-digital native employees. And your digital native employees might not need the level of documentation, and they might think it's sort of silly to go to this really long training about how to use an app as a time card.
Hey, Alex, at what point does this become too much for somebody? Like I'm thinking about my time at Accenture. You say, okay, we've just got hired to implement SAP at company X, right? And so there's a technical component of I have to get the system in a year and a half,
Yeah.
and there's all of that. That's already enough to fill up my day, right? Getting
Mhm.
a complex implementation started from front to finish. As we now overlay or place alongside that, don't forget that you have this age cohort and that age cohort and this race cohort and that other race cohort, right? And this background cohort, people who went to college, people who didn't go to college, people who were privileged, people who were underprivileged,
Mhm.
right? It seems that it becomes almost like another entire job to manage the environment in which the technical piece of getting that implementation gets done. As a former project manager, my sense is that's a whole nother job now.
And is it
Yeah.
worth it? If I could just tack on to, is it even worth it? I mean, my other question to add on to Carlos is, Alex, are you seeing, age discrimination where companies are saying, you know what, it's not worth all the extra time and effort and maybe technology. These people are going to sunset out in the next 8 years. Why am I going to invest, in all of that?
Yeah. I would say from a productivity point, it's worth it to meet your employees where they are. And Carlos, to your point, I think you're seeing more and more companies bring on diversity officers, or diversity roles, right? It doesn't have to be an officer role. It could be an individual contributor within HR that's responsible for, identifying those groups. My role was a net new add to the organization where I am now. Just because of that, because of the complex system, implementations. The way I describe it, kind of thinking about, just processes, right? If you've ever moved. So you move and then you have to unpack, but at the same time, you have to keep up with like the laundry and the dishes, right? So you're implementing the system, but then you have the day-to-day stuff, right? So, you're implementing the system, the day-to-day stuff, keeps kind of going from there. And I think what happens is if you ignore those populations, they're not punching because they can't, find the instructions and, a way that makes sense to them. It turns into a lot of, manual work and hand holding for HR to correct that. Most people, if they don't know where their paycheck is or they can't find things, they call. They
And at least anecdotal for me, I've
Yeah.
handled a lot of different things, right? When I was incorporating, including someone who transitioned from male to female. This is 10 years ago.
Sure.
So, but I tell you that for at least for me personally, the hardest thing I've ever dealt with was an older employee who didn't like being managed by somebody who's 20 years younger. By
I think
far,
that is hard. I think that is hard.
one of the most stressful challenges I had as a manager, as a partner, of getting someone to accept the fact that the person who's going to be managing them, right, was a generational shift. And so
Yeah.
as we see that as part of the workforce, how do you help somebody work through that, Alex? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think really understanding job titles, job roles, job responsibilities, somebody's credentials for coming into that management role, and being able to take that information to the employee that's struggling, and saying, these are the reasons why this person is qualified. These are the reasons why this person was put into this role. These are the reasons why we think they'll be successful in this role, right? Everything starts from the top. I think if you have a senior leadership team that doesn't think that, you know, to your point, your last question, all of these little pieces, do they really require this attention? Can we just implement and, ignore how shifting our society is? My answer is no, as somebody who's done a few of these implementations. But I think really explaining the why and the how we got here, and, sort of bringing people kind of through that journey, as opposed to being like, well, it is the way it is now, sorry.
I think the final thought, or at least what I went through, was that the person had a real, almost like cognitive problem with, okay, on the one hand, you say that experience is so important, right? And I've been doing this job for 20 years, longer than this person who's not going to manage me. But on the other hand, you're willing to put someone who has a fifth of my time doing this to oversee me. So it was working through that conversation of, well, yes, it's not a hypocritical statement, right? Experience is important, but to your point, there are other things that led us to make this particular decision about who was going to run the business.
Yeah, exactly. And you're coming out of consulting, so I think tying it all to operational outcomes and KPIs is really important. What are the skills and experiences that this junior employee has and can bring to the table that made it make sense to make them the manager? Are we creating automation within the group? Do they have skills in that?
Right.
And I think really making sure that your more tenured employee understands that their experience is still incredibly valuable, that, what they bring to the table still matters.
I think it's interesting, the previous article we were talking about, this new collar workforce, idea and the skills-based hiring. I mean, I haven't seen a connection, and Carlos, you and I have talked about, I think our first ever show, we talked about kind of the state of education and the disconnect between education and the workforce. It's been a long time for me since I've seen a real connection, especially in the US, between graduates and jobs. And, even that article from Harvard Business Review, even talks about, Ginny Rometty, the previous CEO of IBM, kind of doing away with a lot of those policies of, educational degree prerequisites. I mean, I think she even started, low woman on the totem pole and kind of worked her way up through IBM. You wonder how many other people didn't get that chance because of those policies. But I'm just wondering, why is this a kind of a new conversation, Alex? Because, it seems to me that there's been a challenge in at least in technology from my standpoint, and software. You mentioned software, and I know you spent a lot of time in software recruiting. There's been a disconnect for a long time of not enough graduates that meet certain prerequisites, and companies that, have had to implement their own training programs, their own certification programs, basically their own colleges to get people up to speed, whether they graduated from a traditional institution or not.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Dan. I think that's where this is coming from, right? I think that there's been such a long gap between, college students being, the right numbers, having the right skills to meet the workforce's needs. And people can go online now and learn these skills, right? They don't have to take the time to go, step out of the workforce and get a 4-year degree to learn how to code anymore. You can have, something that you do for work and learn these skills on the side. And, I think the sort of needs of the job market, have really shown that we're willing to look at these programs, to look at these, boot camps from UMass, Columbia, MIT, all your major universities have these tech boot camps now, learn how to code in 12 weeks, or there's paid programs like Treehouse, and, organizations are offering tuition reimbursement as well. If having that degree is important to you, can you upskill your workforce by offering them tuition reimbursement so they can achieve that degree program while also contributing to your tech stack?
But there's a culture element here too, right? Because this is
absolutely.
for now, this is primarily, I think, an American phenomenon. When I was consulting, we would always say that if you were going to meet with a C-level executive in Europe, you could almost define before you said one word to that person their career path.
Sure.
They had to high school and done this. They had got a degree in that. They had got a master's in whatever. If you were in Germany, a lot of them were going to be PhDs, right?
Yeah.
And so it was really shocking, if ever, to find, let's say, someone who's a CIO or a chief procurement officer in a place like in Germany who hadn't had a very specific path. In the US, it was completely different. You could run into a CIO who used to work in HR, right? Or chief marketing officer who was head of sales, or might have been even a supply chain person. So I think this country has always been a little bit more open. Or the famous cursor example, actually at IBM, right? It became there from more open to this conversation. And I ultimately blame higher ed. I think that this is a supply problem. The reason these are happening
makes sense.
is that if the universities had done their job and had delivered what the companies needed, you wouldn't have this. They're discounting the degree because the universities aren't creating the value in the degree.
Right. They're not putting out enough people that have the right degrees to fill the gaps in employment, that they're starting to, have to say, okay, this is the skill. And if you didn't learn it at a 4-year degree, but you learned the skill somewhere else, is it still a valid skill? I think in a lot of companies are coming down to a yes when they ask themselves that question. Do you think the 4-year degree makes somebody more qualified? And that's a cultural conversation that companies, need to have with themselves. Is there, a reason that somebody needs to have a 4-year degree in a particular position?
I think it's a bigger question. I think it's a bigger question as to who is responsible for educating the workforce, right? The obvious answer is academia, but like to your point, Carlos, you could argue they've failed. And so the pendulum kind of shifted, at least again in technology, to, companies providing the training. But, and then this article even mentions, companies, recommends that companies should provide these on-ramps, apprenticeships, internships, training. But why should they, right? Because the other part, Alex, is I think employee loyalty is at an all-time low, right? People are not, you could argue 7-8 years ago was the era of, companies not, many companies not, being loyal to their employees. And I think that's shifted. I think employees at this point, they could care less about working for a big brand company if that big brand company isn't, being flexible and taking care of their needs and creating the job that they really want to have. So if I'm the company, why am I going to invest years and years and millions of dollars in training you if you're going to just go to my competitor next week?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. On one of Carlos's points about other cultures, right, and employment here versus elsewhere, I spent a bit of time studying employment in Asia while I was doing my MBA in startup cultures in Asia. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is the gig economy was booming in Asia in 2018, 2019, just as we were starting to see it kind of trend down here, right? It was kind of hot for a second, and then people realized that, oh, you get your healthcare through work.
Right.
Right? So I think, because of the way our culture is set up, because, the way we get our healthcare, through employers, it drives people to look at corporate careers, in a positive way. So there might not be that same level of brand loyalty, but I think there is sort of a corporate America loyalty still, that, companies offer the best benefits, the best, lifestyle, the best things from that nature. And I think that's still attractive to a lot of people. The article that was about the new collar workforce, talks about, having access to that, even though you don't have access to a degree, by companies going to skill-based hiring, right? So, providing access to your employees, to your, really strong corporate benefits as a tech company, which, is more common than in some, blue collar careers, et cetera. And, really looking at that in bringing people into that workforce. But, to your point as well, is it because the education system failed to provide, qualified people coming out that way?
Well,
That's a great question.
I think also
Yeah.
there's a big piece of infrastructure missing, which is an interesting business opportunity for somebody to take on, right? Or at least
Right.
for companies to take on. And that is we take it for granted that if you say I went to Babson, I got a degree from any number, let's say it's 500 schools in America, right? That
Yeah.
that 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 accreditation system, right,
Yeah.
is a huge benefit to the people who graduate. We don't question whether your degree is worth something. What's missing is, and I've heard the term used, skills passport in the past, where let's say
Mhm.
you don't go to college and you want to prove to the universe of employers that you know X, right? And so
Mhm.
there is a system where you go, okay, I'm going to take these tests. And once I take these tests, there is a centralized record, right?
Mhm.
A blockchain today, right? That says, yeah, Carlos knows whatever. Okay, he knows
Yeah.
something about crypto. And so as I amass, I think back to the old, Boy Scout merit badge model, right?
Yeah.
As I amass these tokens, that eventually they become the equivalent, and they're transport, they're fluid. They're accepted by as many companies that accept the college degree. It's in
Mhm.
some ways I might trust a distributed ledger that has a record of what this person has achieved. I've implemented SAP 5 times, PeopleSoft 5 times, whatever it is, right? More than, okay, a degree, a piece of paper from a school that you got 10 years ago, right?
Especially if there's a group that you trust, like a neutral group that accredits them. I think I shared on a previous show, we found out even with our certified intelligent automation training program that people were more interested in getting the certification than the training. Even people that, I would consider an expert came to us because they wanted the certification, because they felt that, having the, in our case, the ERPA AI, logo attached to their resume or their slide deck was valuable. So Alex, maybe are there other
Yeah.
examples of that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn tries to fill that gap. I don't think, they fill that gap. I think what I see more commonly is CTOs having to have people in their team that are strong technical interviewers, that can conduct a strong coding interview, that can evaluate candidates on a case by case basis, based on their technical skills and the way that team operates. Um, and yeah, unfortunately, there isn't a standard that, I'm aware of. Yeah.
It baffles me because I could imagine why have an MIT, Stanford, like VTech,
Mhm.
whatever, let's say 20 schools, 10 companies said, look, we're each going to contribute, right? It's going to be a nonprofit like I can, and say, you're going to build and manage, right, the
Mhm.
skills passport in the tech world, and design a way that a worker, whether they're in Mumbai, right, or Phoenix, where they are, that they've got this digital skills passport, and that this is accepted, right? It allows you to quote unquote travel and work anywhere. And I really could see that in 10 years, that being more important than any degree in
Yeah.
technology. Right.
Yeah. I think if we continue to see, market growth of technology as we have, and I think we all know here technology is not going anywhere.
Right.
And there's continued need for more technical coders, more technical engineers. Dan, to your point, artificial intelligence, robotic process automation skills. Um, and as skills increase like that, do you need to go get a master's in AI, or as somebody with a 4-year degree, can you learn AI coding skills and change jobs that way too? Right?
Hey, Alex, I have one other question for you, and that is, we read a lot of things, and we talked about some of the articles. Are there is there a trend in HR or some sort of evolution that you think isn't being documented? Where you say, I'm seeing this kind of on the front lines, and it still hasn't sort of made the headlines yet, or something that we might be talking about in a couple of years?
Yeah, I think seeing things like skills, whether or not people have degrees, and age really coming into the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging conversation is something that's happening in real time that might not be, sort of a trending hashtag, if you will. I think a lot of companies are looking at, the number of open positions that they have, and, trying to be creative. They have to get creative, right? Because there are only so many, degreed engineers, and how do we bring them in? How do we grow them? Here in New England, there's a technical school in the Worcester area, and the Northeastern have co-op programs where you can bring in engineers who are still in school for a semester at a time, bring them into your engineering group and try them out and see if they fit. And it's a great way to, know when you're hiring someone right out of school, if they have the skills and experience and the cohesion to work with your team. But I think you're starting to see more intern programs, like noted in that article, that are about coming out of boot camps and out of skills trainings. And, can we have an intern program that pulls people just out of technical schools? Do they have to come out of 4-year degrees?
Alix, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both. A pleasure as always.
Thank you, Alex.
Carlos, interesting stuff there. It's good to, as we always talk about, hear from somebody, on the front lines of this stuff, and not just behind the headlines. But the thing that jumped out at me that she said towards the beginning was the idea of these layoffs being a result of just trying to meet headcount numbers and financial numbers. It's something we've talked about, on this show.
Right, and again, we've talked about the difference between a layoff because it's a financially driven, right, or let's call it existential sort of situation, and the one that's laid off because somebody's trying to keep their EPS or whatever, all the dials kind of put it in the same direction, and people are pretty smart about which one are we dealing with, right? Is this a real, let's say, strategic or a real reason for why the company's doing this, or is it something that, look, the managers either just want to keep numbers going in the right direction, or they messed up, right? Bad management. They should never have done this in the first place, and now someone's paying the price. What I go back to, something that Alex said that I always find fascinating, is this issue of healthcare, right? Because I was just in Europe, and I have a good friend who spent a lot of time in most of his career working in Belgium, and now is working for an American company. And he's always staggered by the fact that healthcare, not for him because he lives in Belgium, but how he sees the employment relationship in such a different way than his American colleagues do, right? He's the chief sales officer, and how people who work for him really they can't separate work from healthcare for the most part, right? It's so that for him it just never occurred to him, and he had never had to think about, oh, can I go to the doctor if I change jobs?
It's a really interesting topic, right? The idea of kind of decoupling healthcare from employers. Maybe we'll have to have Alix on another meeting to talk about the pros and cons of that from an insider perspective. But I think it's a very interesting topic, and I just think back to with all the hiring, and we talked about this. I think some research, a few weeks ago, where they talked about just the lost innovation that happens in these large companies with all of the turnover. If anybody here is looking, any leaders looking for another business idea, right? Retaining that IP and all that innovation, despite the turnover, is just a huge challenge.
It's such an interesting thing, right? Because you really do see that there is now this other management layer that now, as a leader, as a manager, you have to deal with. It's just society has changed. One of the things that I always found fascinating is looking back. There's a great documentary called Apollo 11. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend you see it. It's a wonderful film, came out a couple of years ago. And it was all this sort of never before seen footage of the Apollo 11 program, right? The thing that strikes you watching it now is how this is the least diverse team in human history, at least in American history, right? So you contrast the achievement of what they did, right? They put us man on the moon, quote unquote. But as the camera pans, right, all you see are white guys. I mean, from start to finish, right? And so you couldn't run that program that way today. And so the question now becomes, they didn't have, I assume they didn't have diversity meetings at NASA in 1967, right? They had to put a person on the moon, and that was the problem. Today, it's so much more complicated. And we just announced this new Artemis rocket, right?
Yeah.
Of course, the first thing everybody sees is, okay, there's 2 white guys, there's a woman, there's a black guy who's, the astronaut diversity committee obviously filtered this. And so now you have this issue as a manager that you have this incredibly, increasingly complex layer that sits alongside the technical aspect of doing the job. And I think that's not, I don't think I quite understood that completely until recently, that how it is that you're really doing two completely separate jobs now, right? To do this at a high level. You must build the system, right? Put the person into space, whatever. And at the same time, you've got this whole collection of issues driven by social change, right, and dialogue that you're going to have to manage at the same time. And by the way, it's the second one that's probably the bigger risk to your career than the first one these days.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the training of managers maybe hasn't caught up to that, right? That as we think about what does it mean to be a leader, you now realize, look, you've got a technical component, right? You've got the social component. The social component is more of a risk to you, perhaps, right, in terms of the longevity of your career, maybe even than the technical component. And that certainly wasn't the case even 10 years ago. Right?
Yeah.
That has that pivot, that reversal socially is what I keep getting from these articles and from these interviews. It's a fascinatingly different world. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a great show next week. Next week, we'll have the former head of privacy for Amazon Alexa on the show. So, we've been talking about cybersecurity and government infiltration and TikTok bans and things. So that should be a very relevant show, hopefully for everybody watching.
Normal programming will resume next week.
There you go. But great topic, Carlos. Thanks as always. And for anybody watching, we'll be back next Wednesday, live noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. In the meantime, if there's anything we could do to help, let us know. Otherwise, Carlos, have a great week, buddy.
Thanks to you, Dan. Thanks to everyone watching. Have a good week, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.